Hello fellow bookworms! I read a framed anthology, and I'll explain what that is in a sec, by indie author Michael Wombat called Madame Monvoisin. Monvoisin. It's really hard to get my mouth to say Monvoisin. I tried. And I thought, I don't recall reading any other framed anthologies. What a brilliant idea! And then of course I wanted to know all about frame stories, what forms they come in, and what have I read that contains them. You know, standard rabbit hole stuff. And now that they've been brought to my attention, I'm seeing them everywhere. It turns out that although I may not have read any other framed anthologies that I can remember, I have certainly heard of them. The most popular one that I know is 1001 Nights, also called Arabian Nights. You know that iconic story where Scheherazade tells a story each night to her husband Shahryar to prevent him getting bored and permanently removing her life from the plot, if you get my algorithm-friendly meaning. This story is one of the oldest discovered examples. Other examples of story framing have been dated all the way back to ancient Egypt and India. I'm not sure what the oldest discovered one is, although I did try to find out. And it's clearly a successful device because I've watched and listened to plenty of modern stories in films and music, as well as books using this particular literary device. I just didn't know what it was called. So, framed stories, let's get into it. First, I need to get some terminology cleared up because there are so many different terms and sometimes these terms were used seemingly interchangeably. So it took me a little while to figure out what meant what. It also made it really tricky to know what phrases to search for. So, framed stories are also called framed tales, framed narratives, sandwich narratives, and for some reason intercalation. I want to call it intercalcation for some reason, but it's intercalation. I also saw a lot of stuff about embedded narratives, stories within stories, and nested stories. These terms can refer to the stories that are embedded in a framed narrative or not, but I'll get to that later. First, frame stories. A framed story can be used to add context or to add an extra layer of complexity, ease you into the concept of a story, help you accept something you might reject at first, or if you have a collection of stories that you want to bring together, you can add in a sort of bonus story to use as a launching point that weaves the narratives together. There are probably a lot of ways to use the frame that I'm missing, but basically it's a thing to help frame a story in some way and add cohesion. This can be done in many ways. A basic framed story does what it says on the tin. A small section of a secondary story can be at the beginning and end to provide extra context or dimension to the main story. Like the Titanic with her grandmother and her granddaughter? Anyway, they see a drawing on the news that has been dragged up from the depths of the ocean and for some reason it is pristine. And the grandma says, "That's me!" And then we see her main story as a young lady aboard the Titanic, and it ends with a closing frame that is the conclusion to the now old lady's story. The main story is the young lady's, and the grandmother's story is the frame that's being used to add a reason for this story to be told, which gives us an extra reason as to why we should care for this particular protagonist. The Princess Bride is also a framed story. The main story is the action scene with Inigo and Montoya and everybody else. You know, those other characters. And the frame is the grandfather reading to his grandson, and they both pop in and out during the course of the film, giving context, adding humour or suspense, or just avoiding the kissing scenes. Again, the story starts and ends with the granddad's frames. But there are other ways to do this. You can add multiple stories and have the main story be the frame. Michael Wombat's book, Madame Monvoisin, say it fast and you won't know I've said it wrong. Madame Monvoisin, it's a framed anthology. It's not only where this particular research rabbit hole started for me, but it's a good example of a framed narrative. It has its frame, which in this case is the main story, and that follows a man who has been ostracized by others because of a disfigurement. And he is further isolated because he doesn't like to spend his money and free time drinking. Me also. He's also shy around the general public because of his disfigurement and the looks and comments he gets as a result of it. It's his story that allows the opening up of the embedded stories, also called story in story, when he finds a shop that sells adventures. For a price, you can touch an object and with the right word from the right woman being the mysterious and charming Madame Monvoisin, you can be transported to a moment that the owner of the object experienced, and you experience it as that person. Their thoughts, their feelings, their life. The stories can be short or long, of this world or not, from life or death, which means the author has scope to play with all the genres: sci-fi, high fantasy, historical fiction, horror. You know, all the genres. These short embedded stories don't relate to each other. Only the main frame story has the longer narrative that spans the book, taking you from one adventure to another, whilst the main character tries to solve the mystery of the person who sells these adventures. Again, we begin and end with the frame story of this shy man. So, A frame story can be a main story that is used to frame a shorter story or series of short stories, or a short story that is used to frame a longer narrative. But what about multi-frame narratives? I'm pretty sure that I've only given examples of single story frames, and I tried to go down another mini rabbit hole for multi-frames, because whilst I saw that Frankenstein was frequently cited as an example of a framed narrative, Wiki mentioned it was a multi-frame narrative, which is super interesting as a format concept, but I have to say it sounds to me like an example of a framed narrative with nested stories, not a multiple frame. This is what I mean by things getting a little murky. In fact, on the page about nested stories, it also has Frankenstein as an example, so I'm having to completely rely on Wikipedia here, since the last time I picked up Frankenstein was many, many years ago, and I DNF'd it because a guy spent, I think it was 6 pages moping on a lake, or maybe I made it to 6 and there was more to come. Either way, was not in the mood for that, and don't yell at me, I'm going to give it another chance, because this was in my Night Circus hating era, so maybe my brain has reset enough for me to at least finish it now? Do you think Frankenstein is a nested story with a frame narrative or a multi-frame narrative? Discuss. But for now, let us move on to embedded narratives and nested stories. Embedded narratives are also called stories within stories. Anytime that a character sits down and tells another character a tale, embedded story. Or in the case of the play Macbeth, which has another play in it, embedded. You can have embedded stories with or without a frame narrative. Dream sequences can also be an example of embedded stories, although there can be times when dreams can be used as a framing device. Take the Night Circus. It doesn't have a dream sequence, but it does have a dream-like sequence. You have the main story that follows the characters, but within that, and spaced throughout the book, is a story that shows an ordinary patron experiencing the Night Circus for the first time. It's there to add another layer of nuance to the book, and not to try and bring the story together. If the patron were to have had this dream of the Night Circus and then awoke and told it to us as the narrator, framed narrative. And finally, nested stories. Nested stories are stories within stories within stories. They can go deep, is what I'm saying. Any story where a character is telling a story which references another character who also tells a story can be considered nested. You can nest multiple times. You could, theoretically, nest infinitely. Think Inception, where you go down through layers of dreams. Each dream layer has a different setting, which is plucked from one of the protagonist's heads. Each dream layer has slightly different rules, and the deeper you go, the slower time gets in the real world. Stories within stories, dreams within dreams. Cloud Atlas has 6 nested stories, and single-handedly answered my question of, can you have nested stories with no frame? Yeah, you can. Inception, I would say, definitely has a frame, and that frame is the waking world, whereas Cloud Atlas links to itself using books or music or the laws it creates as a tether to link them all together. Because none of the stories share a time or place or character, there's nothing to frame it with, so you have these links that go through. It's frameless. So, I hope you enjoyed my little rabbit hole dive, but before I wish you a fond farewell, I suggest you check out Wombat's book. He's an indie author and a really good guy who I would love to send some love his way. But I will warn you, some of the language in his books can be quite crude, by which I mean rude kind of crude, not basic crude. So if that's not your thing, here's your warning. With that being said, have a great time of day you are in, stay spiffy, give ears to the notification bell if you feel so inclined, and toodle pip. By Michael Wombat called... I've got stuff in the attic.